You think being more psychologically developed than those around you is an achievement to celebrate? Maslow discovered something that disturbed him deeply in his research on self-actualized individuals. He found that people who genuinely develop beyond the psychological norm of their environment face a specific danger he rarely discussed publicly, not from others attacking them, but from their own potential for what he called elitism, isolation, and spiritual narcissism. These psychologically mature people weren't just lonely. They were at risk of developing a superiority complex that would actually reverse their development. The most troubling part? Maslow identified that believing you've evolved beyond everyone around you is often itself a sign that you haven't developed as much as you think. And this belief creates psychological dangers that could destroy both your development and your capacity for genuine human connection. It's a trap disguised as achievement. And the people most vulnerable to it are often those doing legitimate developmental work who mistake their growth for superiority rather than recognizing it as responsibility. Not every person who feels different from others has actually developed beyond them. There's a critical difference between genuine psychological maturity that creates natural distance from collective norms and narcissistic belief in your own superiority that creates hostile separation. Maslow observed that many people claiming to be more evolved than others were actually exhibiting personality disorders, unresolved trauma responses, or defensive superiority that protected fragile self-esteem. These individuals felt different, but they hadn't developed. They had become alienated, and they were interpreting their alienation as evidence of advancement. But the pattern he documented in genuinely self-actualized people was more nuanced and more humble. These individuals had developed capacities that were statistically rare: superior reality perception, reduced defensiveness, authentic spontaneity. And this development did create distance from people operating from more common psychological structures. But crucially, they didn't interpret this distance as evidence of their superiority. They felt compassion for the struggles they transcended, maintained humility about how much they still didn't understand, and took responsibility for using their development to serve rather than to separate. What appears as evolved development versus narcissistic superiority from outside reflects completely different internal states. Real psychological maturity, according to Maslow's research, includes decreasing sense of being special or superior even as capabilities genuinely expand. In this video, I'm going to reveal what Maslow actually warned about regarding the dangers of developing beyond your environment, including the ego traps that destroy development, the isolation that can become pathological, and the responsibility that comes with genuine growth. You'll discover how to distinguish between authentic development and superiority complex, why feeling more evolved is often a red flag rather than confirmation, and what genuine psychological maturity actually looks like in relating to people at different developmental levels. These are insights from humanistic psychology about the shadow side of growth that self-help culture deliberately ignores. By the end, you'll understand why Maslow considered the belief in your own superiority one of the greatest obstacles to actual self-actualization. This isn't a video validating feelings of being more evolved or special than others. This is psychology warning about the profound dangers, psychological, social, and developmental, that emerge when growth creates distance from your environment, and you respond to that distance with superiority rather than humility. This video is for people who felt increasingly different from those around them and want to understand whether that difference indicates development or pathology. If you found yourself thinking, "I've outgrown everyone," if you feel frustrated by others' lack of awareness, if you started believing you see things others can't, you're at a critical fork. This feeling can indicate either genuine development approach with humility or narcissistic inflation that will destroy your growth. If you're ready to examine this honestly rather than seeking validation, keep watching. Think about the last time you felt frustrated with someone for not understanding something that seemed obvious to you, a psychological insight, a behavioral pattern, a way of seeing reality. Notice what happened internally. Did you feel compassion for where they were in their development and curiosity about how to bridge the gap? Or did you feel superior, frustrated at their limitations, and confirmed in your belief that you're more advanced? That response reveals everything about whether you're experiencing healthy development or narcissistic inflation. Maslow understood that genuine psychological development does create perceptual and cognitive differences. You literally see patterns, understand dynamics, and recognize realities that people at earlier developmental stages don't perceive. This is real, documented, and validated by research. But here's where the danger emerges. Your ego can co-opt this genuine development and transform into evidence of superiority, special status, or evolutionary advancement beyond ordinary people. When this happens, you stop developing. You've created an identity around being evolved that now must be defended, and defending that identity requires maintaining distance from others, interpreting their limitations as evidence of your advancement, and surrounding yourself with people who confirm your special status. This is a trap Maslow warned about. Real development becoming arrested by the belief in your own superiority. The psychological weight of this trap is that it feels like truth. You have genuinely developed capacities others don't have, so the feeling of being different is based on reality. But you're interpreting real differences as hierarchy rather than as diversity, as proof of your superiority rather than as responsibility for service, and that interpretation destroys the very development it claims to represent. Maslow's hierarchy explains why this danger specifically emerges at higher developmental levels and why it's so seductive. At the first 4 levels, physiological needs, safety, love, and belonging, esteem, you're developing along fairly common paths. Your struggles, needs, and growth are things most people understand because most people are working on these levels. But at the 5th level, self-actualization, you enter territory that's statistically uncommon. Only an estimated 2% of people reach this level, and the further you develop within it, the fewer people can relate to your experience. This creates genuine isolation, not from pathology, but from statistics. You're working on developmental challenges that 98% of people haven't encountered. Here's where the danger becomes critical. This isolation can be interpreted 2 ways. The healthy interpretation is, I'm working on developmental territory that's statistically uncommon, and I need to find a small number of people who can relate while maintaining compassion for everyone else. The toxic interpretation is, I've evolved beyond ordinary people, I'm more advanced, and their inability to understand me confirms my superiority. Most people unconsciously drift toward the toxic interpretation because it protects the ego from the pain of genuine isolation. It's easier to feel superior than to feel alone. But this drift is exactly what Maslow warned about. It transforms real development into what he called spiritual narcissism, or elitism of the self-actualized. And once you've entered this territory, you stop growing. You're now maintaining an identity around being evolved rather than continuing to actually evolve. Here's the pattern Maslow documented. Genuinely self-actualized people felt their difference from others as burden or responsibility, not as achievement. They didn't enjoy feeling separate from collective experience. They missed the ease of relating that common developmental level provides. They used their development in service of others rather than as evidence of their superiority. And crucially, they maintained profound humility about how much they still didn't understand, how much further development was possible, and how their unusual capacities came more from circumstances than from personal virtue. The psychiatrist Carl Jung wrote extensively about what he called inflation, a state where the ego identifies with archetypal or transpersonal content and becomes grandiose. He observed that people doing deep psychological work were particularly vulnerable to inflation because they accessed genuine insights and capacities that felt special. Jung warned that inflation was one of the greatest dangers in individuation. The belief that you've achieved something special arrests the development that belief claims to represent. He found that his most successfully individuated patients maintained what he called appropriate humility, recognition that their development was gift and responsibility, rather than personal achievement. The philosopher Ken Wilber extensively studied what he terms pre/trans fallacy, the confusion between pre-rational states, primitive, undeveloped, and trans-rational states, post-conventional, highly developed. He observed that many people experiencing genuine trans-rational development mistakenly believe this makes them superior to merely rational people, not recognizing that rational development was prerequisite to trans-rational. This creates spiritual narcissism, where people use their genuine development as evidence of superiority. Wilber emphasized that every higher stage includes and transcends lower stages. You don't become better than people at lower stages. You've simply integrated what they're working on and moved to different challenges. The psychologist David Hawkins studied what he called levels of consciousness and documented that people at higher levels often develop what he termed spiritual pride, subtle arrogance about their own development. He found this pride was itself a form of lower consciousness that indicated the person hadn't actually integrated the higher levels they believed they'd reached. Genuine higher consciousness, he documented, includes increasing humility, decreasing sense of specialness, and recognition of unity rather than hierarchy between all beings. Insider knowledge from developmental psychology and spiritual psychology confirms what Maslow warned. Believing you're more evolved than others is typically either accurate assessment combined with ego inflation that will arrest your development, or an inaccurate assessment where you mistaken alienation, trauma response, or personality disorder for advancement. Either way, the belief itself is dangerous and must be examined critically. But here's what Maslow specifically warned about regarding the dangers that emerge when you develop beyond your environment, and why these dangers threaten both your continued growth and your humanity. The first danger he identified is loss of feedback and reality testing. When you develop beyond most people around you, you lose access to the social feedback that keeps perception calibrated. If everyone you interact with operates from different assumptions and perceptions, how do you know whether your perceptions are accurate or distorted? You might be seeing clearly what others miss, or you might be descending into delusional thinking that feels profound but is actually ungrounded. Without peers at similar developmental level to provide reality testing, you risk losing touch with consensus reality in ways that become pathological. This is why isolated, self-actualized people sometimes develop strange beliefs. They lack the corrective feedback that collective wisdom provides. The second danger is spiritual narcissism and superiority complex. The most obvious trap: you begin believing you're special, more evolved, more conscious than ordinary people. This belief feels true because you do have genuine capacities others lack, but it's toxic because it transforms development into identity that must be defended. Once you identify as more evolved, you stop questioning yourself, stop remaining open to being wrong, and start selecting information that confirms your special status. This arrests development completely because growth requires humility and openness. The third danger is what Maslow called hostile separation from humanity. When you feel different and interpret that difference as superiority, you begin viewing others with contempt, frustration, or pity rather than compassion. You separate yourself from them, the unaware, the unconscious, the masses. This hostile separation destroys your capacity for genuine intimacy and connection, isolates you in ways that become pathological, and ironically demonstrates that you haven't actually developed as much as you think. Genuine self-actualization includes increasing capacity for love and connection, not decreasing tolerance for others' limitations. The fourth danger Maslow documented is arrested development through satisfaction with current attainment. When you believe you've evolved significantly, you often stop doing the developmental work that created the growth you're now proud of. You've reached a level that feels advanced compared to most people, so you rest there believing you've arrived. But development has no endpoint. There's always further to grow. Satisfaction with having evolved beyond others indicates you've stopped growing, and this stagnation masquerades as achievement. The fifth danger is misuse of genuine capacities for ego gratification rather than service. If you develop superior reality perception, emotional regulation, or psychological insight, you can use these capacities to manipulate, control, or demonstrate your superiority rather than to help serve or contribute. Your development becomes weaponized for ego purposes rather than being used for the growth and service it was meant for. This corrupts the development itself. Genuine capacities twisted toward toxic ends. The sixth danger is creation of false hierarchy where diversity exists. You interpret developmental differences as vertical hierarchy. You're higher, they're lower, rather than as horizontal diversity where people are working on different challenges. This false hierarchy creates suffering for everyone involved. You feel burdened by your superiority. Others feel judged or inadequate. And the actual reality, that development is multidimensional with people advanced in some areas and less developed in others, gets obscured. The seventh danger, and perhaps most insidious, is the belief itself becoming evidence you haven't developed as much as you think. Maslow's research showed that genuinely self-actualized people rarely believed they were more evolved than others. They felt different, sometimes isolated, but they maintained profound humility about their own limitations and recognition of others' strengths in areas where they were still developing. The people most confident about having evolved beyond others were often those who'd achieved some development, but had then become inflated by it. The very confidence in your superiority is red flag that you've stopped developing and entered narcissistic territory. The transformation that's required when you recognize you're falling into these traps or realize you're at risk of them involves fundamental shifts in how you relate to your own development and others at different levels. Remember that feeling of superiority when you understood something others didn't, that frustration with others' limitations, that sense of being more conscious than those around you. When you recognize these as danger signals rather than as validation, your entire relationship with development transforms. You stop using your growth as evidence of superiority and start seeing it as responsibility. Every capacity you develop becomes obligation to serve rather than achievement to celebrate. You're not more evolved. You're more capable of helping, and that capability demands humility rather than pride. Your frustration with others' limitations transforms into compassion when you remember that you were once at their level, that you developed through circumstances and support that were somewhat lucky rather than solely through your virtue, and that their limitations are their current developmental challenges rather than evidence of inferiority. You develop what Buddhists call beginner's mind, maintaining recognition that you're still learning, still developing, still making mistakes despite your growth. This prevents a stagnation that comes from believing you've arrived. Your relationships transform from hierarchical to horizontal. Instead of viewing people as less developed versions of what you become, you see them as working on different aspects of multidimensional development. They may be less developed in areas you've grown, but more developed in areas where you still struggle. This recognition maintains humility and genuine respect. Your isolation transforms from hostile separation to compassionate distance. You maintain appropriate boundaries with people whose consciousness level is very different from yours, not because they're inferior, but because the relational dynamics don't serve either of you. But you maintain this distance with love rather than contempt, with recognition of shared humanity rather than belief in hierarchy. Even your sense of identity transforms from "I am more evolved" to "I am continuing to develop and have been fortunate to receive the support and circumstances that enable growth I recognize many others haven't had access to." Now here's where Maslow's warning becomes not just cautionary, but practically essential for anyone experiencing genuine developmental growth. The way you respond to developing beyond your environment determines whether that development continues or rests. If you respond with superiority, judgment, or hostile separation, your development stops. You've created an ego structure around being evolved that now prevents further evolution. If you respond with humility, compassion, and responsibility, development can continue because you haven't made an identity out of it that must be defended. Here's the practice Maslow implicitly recommended. Regularly examine whether you're using your development to serve or to separate. Are your capacities being expressed as contribution or as evidence of superiority? Do you feel compassion for people at earlier developmental stages, or contempt? Can you recognize your own continued limitations and areas where others are more developed than you? Or do you unconsciously maintain belief in your overall superiority? Do you seek out people who challenge and exceed you in various domains? Or do you surround yourself with people who confirm your special status? These questions provide reality testing that prevents the traps Maslow warned about. Additionally, actively practice humility by remembering your development came significantly from circumstances you didn't choose, genetics, early environment, opportunities, privileges. Someone with different circumstances might have developed far beyond where you are. You remain limited, ignorant, and flawed in countless ways that your current development doesn't address. Recognizing this maintains appropriate humility. People you consider less developed may be more developed than you in dimensions you're not perceiving. Emotional intelligence, practical wisdom, kindness, integrity. These don't necessarily correlate with psychological self-actualization. Someone at lower stages might be more genuinely loving, ethical, or wise than you are despite your psychological capacities. Development is service opportunity, not achievement. The more you've developed, the more responsibility you have to contribute rather than separate. This frames growth as burden and gift rather than as evidence of superiority. Here's the most important recognition Maslow documented. If you believe you've evolved beyond everyone around you, you almost certainly haven't developed as much as you think, or you've developed in ways that have become toxic through inflation. Genuinely self-actualized people Maslow studied felt different, but not superior. They struggled with isolation, but didn't interpret it as evidence of their advancement. They had unusual capacities, but recognized them as gifts that brought responsibility rather than as achievements proving their worth. The moment you start thinking, I've evolved beyond these people, you've likely entered narcissistic territory that will prevent further growth. The healthier frame is, I've been fortunate to develop in some areas that are statistically uncommon, and this development brings both genuine differences from collective norms and responsibility to use these capacities for service rather than separation. If you recognize yourself in the patterns this video has described, if you've been feeling superior to others because of your development, you're at a critical choice point. You could offend the superiority belief, which will arrest your development and increasingly isolate you in toxic ways. Or you can recognize the trap, recommit to humility, and understand that real psychological maturity includes decreasing sense of being special even as capabilities expand. The path forward requires brutal honesty about whether you've been using your development to feel superior rather than to serve, whether you created identity around being evolved that now must be defended, and whether you've mistaken alienation or personality issues for advancement. This examination is painful but essential because the trap Maslow warned about destroys both your development and your humanity if left unaddressed. In the next video, I'm going to reveal how genuinely self-actualized people maintain connection and contribution while operating from developmental levels that are statistically uncommon, how they bridge the gap between their development and collective norms without either dumbing themselves down or becoming superior. Until then, if you felt you evolved beyond those around you, examine whether that feeling brings humility and responsibility or whether it brings satisfaction and sense of superiority. Your answer reveals whether you're developing authentically or falling into the trap that stops development completely. Subscribe if you want to understand the complete psychology of development, including the shadow sides, ego traps, and dangers that self-help culture ignores while promising you superiority disguised as growth.